Okay, this class is chapter 2 of Tanya, written by Shner Zalman, the author of the Tanya, begins chapter 2 with the following. And you have the link, or Sylvia, you want to post the link in the chat, because I'm going to be reading some of the text today, straight from the text of the Tanya. So let's jump right in and let us indeed look at the Tanya text. Actually, let me share my screen. I'm going to share my screen, and Sylvia, you can make sure everyone's on mute unless they have a question. And here I'm sharing my screen. You guys should have the link in the website, in the email that I sent today. And if not, you can look at my screen. The second uniquely Jewish soul is truly a part of God above. So the first soul we spoke about in chapter 1. I don't want to recap. You can go back and view that. The second soul, the second uniquely Jewish soul is truly a part of God above. Let's continue. A part of God above is a quotation from scripture. The Alter Rebbe, who is the author of the Tanya, adds the word truly. It is truly. The second soul is truly a part of God. To stress the literal meaning of these words, for as is known, some verses employ hyperbolic language. But here the Rebbe is saying the second soul is truly a part of God. Let's continue to the bold, which is the actual text of the Tanya. As it is written concerning Adam, whose soul was a comprehensive one, in that it contained all the particular souls of subsequent generations. And what does it say in Genesis about Adam? And God blew into his nostrils a soul of life. Let's continue. And as we say in prayer concerning the soul of every individual Jew, you blew into me. We say this every morning in the prayer book, and you blew into me. The significance of the verb to blow as it relates to the infusion of the Jewish soul is now explained. What's this idea that we're saying God blew? He blew into the nostrils of Adam a soul of life. Or we say in the prayer book, and you blew. What's his business of blowing? As it is written in the Zohar, which is Kabbalah, he who blows, blows from within him. Again, we're going to explain this soon in our own words, but let's just continue with the actual text of chapter 2. He who blows, blows from within him. That is to say, from his inwardness and his innermost being. For it is of his inward and innermost vitality that a man emits through blowing with force. So too, allegorically speaking, have Jewish souls risen in the divine soul, in the divine thought. I'm going to stop to share and back to our language of 2012. So in the creation of Genesis, of the 6 days of creation, it said, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, let there be the sea and the sun and the stars, and there were all these amazing things. God said, let there be the sun, and there was a sun. God said, let there be the higher celestial stars, and that's what there was. God said, let there be animals, and there were animals. All of a sudden comes Friday afternoon before Shabbat, where he's ready to create the human species, and no longer is the text in Genesis state, and he said, there shall be Adam and Eve. He could have said, and he said, let there be light, and he said, let there be. He didn't say that. All of a sudden, he changes the language, God. And God says, he formed Adam out of the clay from the ground, and he blew this soul into his nostrils, something very different. And the Zohar, the Kabbalah, addresses this, obviously. Because blowing comes from the inwardness of the individual. So for me to speak for an hour on Zoom is definitely no big deal. For a politician to speak and filibuster in Congress for 32 hours, also no big deal. Why? Because there's me, Mendel Schwartz, and speech is something external. It's not connected with my essence, my speech, to the extent that I can even say things and I don't even mean it. I can say, I love you, and I don't mean it. Why? Because the words I love you is a speech, it's utterances coming out of my mouth, but it's not connected to me. Or if I say, I like broccoli, but I really don't like broccoli. Or I like squash, I don't like squash, whatever the case is. So speech is an external characteristic trait or talent that I have. Now, of course, speech is very important because speech allows me to articulate what I'm feeling towards you. Some people that cannot speak, whether they're mute or certain other creatures that have a hard time with speech. So speech is a wonderful thing, especially when we know how to communicate. Speech is a wonderful thing. But speech, because it's external, it's words that I'm using. It's not me. It's not my essence. Like we say, love is beyond words. I'm going to try to explain now in one sentence why I love my wife. It's not going to work because the love, the essence that I have for my wife is much greater than my words. Of course, words are important, so I can articulate to my wife and actually utter the words, I love you. But the words or speech is something external outside of me. And that's where a person can filibuster for hours and hours and hours and not even get tired. Whereas if I blowing, I could only go for so long. You can blow 1 balloon, 2 balloons, 10 balloons. After a while, you're going to tire. You're going to tire quite quickly. You can try it after 5 minutes. After 1 minute, you probably won't be able to blow strong. Why? Because blowing comes from the innermost, comes from my essence. So when God is creating Adam and Eve, he no longer uses the word speech of, and he said, let there be light. And then the creation of light was created, or the creation of the sun or the sea was created. That's all for important creatures of the 6 days of creation. But when it comes to the human species, he no longer uses speech, but he uses the terminology of blow, because blowing is in the essence of God. Just like when we blow, it comes from our essence. So God is blowing from his essence into us, into the human species. And that's what we call this divine soul. And he blew the soul of life into Adam and Eve. Okay. There's more to say about this. And I'm going to continue to elaborate on this idea of this second soul. Let's go back to the text though, and we will come back to this as well. Give me a minute. Okay, so just want to go back for a moment. Over here where my mouse is, as it is written concerning Adam, and he blew into his nostrils a soul of life. And it says in the prayer book, you blew into me. So when we're dealing with life in the individual and he blew into his nostrils a soul of life, this is a whole new genre the way we are speaking over here. And he blows, as is written in the Zohar, he who blows, blows from within him. So that's what we explained. I want to further touch upon the second dimension over here of blowing life into Adam and Eve. So what we explained until now was that blowing comes from my essence versus speech. What we're saying over here is actually even deeper than that, which is the second facet to this idea of the divine soul. When God says, let there be light, and there was light, or God said, let there be the ocean, and there was an ocean. So there's God, and there's a sun. There's God, and there's an ocean. In this case of Adam and Eve, where God blew into Adam and Eve life, so he's blowing from himself, and that breath, that life force is now being infused into the human species. So it's not like other creatures that are created out of nothing. So there's God and now there's a sun. The creature of this divine soul is not something that God created. God didn't say, and now I'm going to create a divine soul and I'm going to infuse the human species with this creature called the divine soul. No, the divine soul is not a creation. The divine soul is the breath of God. He blew this soul from God's innermost into the human species. So we're not saying until now, like, the human species has something deeper than all other creatures. The human species has something from God's essence, which is a much greater relationship between the creation and God, more than, let's say, the sun or the ocean. We're saying much more than that. The divine soul is godliness. It is the breath of godliness. Even an angel, how holy and spiritual as it is, an angel is a creation of godliness. God created angels the same way he created animals. An angel may be more refined than an animal, but an animal is a creature of God and an angel is a creature of God. The divine soul isn't a creation. The divine soul is godliness. So God is taking from himself and he's blowing from within him, from his essence, and he's transmitting a piece of him, so to speak, which we're calling his breath, and he's blowing it and inserting it into the human species. It's like taking blood from one person and making a transfusion into the other person. You're simply transmitting. So this is a very fundamental point that I'm sharing with you in the teachings of Kabbalah when we speak about the divine soul. Many people grapple, and it's not at all the point of my discussion tonight, they're trying to figure out, is there a difference between an animal and a human? And everyone says, well, humans are smarter. Okay, well, I'm in the opinion that I know some animals that are smarter than humans, especially in Washington, D.C., no pun intended. So this argument that humans are smarter than animals, and that's why humans are greater or humans are unique, is not a rationale for me. But based on what we just explained now on chapter 2 of the Tanya of this book, which articulates for us why this divine soul is unique to the human species, it's very clear what is unique and special over the human species. Not just over animals, but even over angels. Because an angel is a creation just like the sun, just like the moon, and just like the stars. Whereas the divine soul is not a creation. There's not like there's God from the beginning of time, and now he's going to create something called a divine soul, and he's going to take that creation, that creature, and he's going to infuse it into the human. No, the divine soul is godliness. And he blew that divine soul into the nostrils of Adam and Eve. So when I tell you that you have a divine soul, this is not, we're not playing around with just making you feel good. Like when, your parent would say, you're so amazing, you can be the president of the United States. Maybe yeah, maybe no. Maybe I do have the power, maybe I don't have the power. But when I tell you, you have the power like God himself, you have the power to control your temptations and your addictions. And you have the power to do things that you thought you weren't able to do. So now as a parent, I'm being honest and confident that my child can do it. Or as a rabbi, I'm confident to say that you can do it. Or unto myself, I have feel the confidence I can do it. Why? Because I possess this divine soul. And it's not something that God created and gave to me. It is godliness. I'm a walking, carrying, godly body. So when we say Yiddish neshama or the Pintel Yid, this is real stuff according to the teachings of Judaism. This is the theology of Judaism, is certainly in the teachings of Kabbalah. It's not, this was written hundreds of years ago. This is not like today in 2022, we're trying to make everyone feel good. It's not a fuzzy statement here that you have godliness, you can control your. This is real. And today, unfortunately, and I'm not knocking doctors or anybody else or school teachers, they're constantly giving kids and even adults all these antidepressants and these pills for the ADD, and we have a list of all these pills to suppress and to help the individual. But the teachings of this chapter, if we can truly, truly tap into the essence of this chapter and truly believe it and understand it, that I have a power, and that power is the divine soul, then sky is the limit. And it's not because I have ego, it's because this is the teachings of Judaism. So this idea is not just more theological, this actually is practically to help. This whole book is to help the individual, to help Mendel Schwartz be the best Mendel Schwartz. The best is to help Shira Geller be the best Shira Geller, or the Allens, or the Lisas, whatever the case is. This is not a, it's a difference, the difference between, just so you know, the Kabbalah and Chassidut. Kabbalah, the teachings of Kabbalah up to 250 years ago was more theology, philosophy, kind of teaching us the chart of the celestial worlds and the higher levels of godliness and so on and so forth. The revolution of Chassidut with the beginning of the Baal Shem Tov was, we got to bring this down practically speaking, because we're losing numbers, especially with assimilation and so on and so forth. And if it's not going to be brought down practical, then it just stays in the teachings and in the world of Kabbalah. Whereas Chassidut, which is what we're discussing here, is trying to bring it down practically. Okay, back to any questions before I continue? So again, it's important, those two factors. Blowing comes from the essence, which means it's coming from the essence of the person, from the innermost part of the person, unlike speech. And two, what we explained over here is just like the breath is part of the individual, the divine soul is part of the divine soul is part of God's, and God is simply blowing that breath, blowing that divine soul from himself into the next person. You know, years ago, I was listening to another teacher give this class, and I felt he made a mistake, and he tried to give the metaphor of the divine soul when it says that every human being has a truly a divine soul of godliness, and he brought the metaphor of, you take a rock from a big mountain, and this teacher said, and the rock, this piece of matter, even though it's separated from the mountain, but the rock is like part and parcel of the same mountain. It's the same granite. Just before it was part of the mountain, and that's what is inside of us, a piece of rock, so this piece of granite. But it doesn't jive to me, because one's a mountain and one's a rock. We give it different names, and it's in two different places, and so on and so forth. The idea of this breath, the breath coming from God himself, to me, is much more of a proper metaphor where we can truly say that it's simply a transfusion as part of godliness. Okay, I'm going back to sharing the screen over here. Okay, it is written in Zohar, he who blows, blows from within him. That is to say, from his inwardness and his innermost being. For it is of his inward and innermost vitality that man emits through blowing with force. Okay, so we know now it comes from the essence. And so too, allegorically speaking, have Jewish souls risen in the divine thought. The Jew has his source in divine thought, the innermost level of godliness. All other created beings, even angels, are rooted in and created by divine speech. Speech is external in comparison with thought, as we explained. And as it is written regarding the Jewish nation, Israel is my firstborn son. And concerning Jews as individuals, you are children unto your Lord. That is to say, the significance of the Jews being called God's child is that just as a child is derived from its father's brain, his inner and essential being, so too, to use an anthropomorphism, is the soul of every Jew derived from God's thought and wisdom. We're going to skip some of these paragraphs because we got to get further over here. This is just all, by the way, like more like parentheses in the chapter. So I'm just going to keep on going a little bit further over here. Okay. Wow, a lot of extra time over here. Okay, we said above that we come from God's thought, from his brain. Let me read these two paragraphs with you, and then we'll use it in our own language. The manner of the soul's descent is analogous to a child who is derived from his father's brain. Even the nails of his feet come into existence from the very same drop of semen which comes from the father's brain. How then were nails created from it? By being in the mother's womb for 9 months, descending degree by degree, changing continually until even the nails are formed from it. Okay, I know this is a bit loaded, but let's come back to me here. Again, you have this text, which I'm sharing. You have the link, so there's nothing, I'm not trying to pull anything over anyone's eyes over here. The link was in the email, and I think Sylvia also shared the link in the chat. So you have this for your own take home as well. You can always go back to the text whenever you'd like. Okay. When we say God blew into us, it's a bit strange because God doesn't have a mouth and God doesn't have nose. He doesn't have a breath. So I saw your question, Stephen. Thanks a lot. So it is a little bit funny when we use these terms. So the Rambam Maimonides tells us that any time we see God using any part of his body, it is just to let us understand and appreciate a little bit himself. So God doesn't remain some like ghost-like figure, but we can have a little bit more of a relationship with God. So when it says, for example, God used his right hand to hug the nations, it means right hand is being more loving, or he uses his left hand to reject people. So again, that God doesn't have a left hand, but left generally means rejection. Right means all embracing. It says God took the Jewish people with his outstretched hand and redeemed them from Egypt and brought them out into the land, into the desert, right? God doesn't have an out. We even have the chicken neck on the Seder table, on the Seder plate, we have the chicken neck, right? Because God's outstretched, but God doesn't have an outstretched hand. So again, it's just for us to understand and appreciate a little bit of how in the language of the people. That's what Maimonides tells us, not to, God forbid, think that God has a mouth, because that's a form of idol worship. So it's a metaphor. The metaphor, the idea of God blowing life into the nostrils of Adam and Eve is a metaphor for us that he's blowing from his essence, as we explained before. Now, the problem is, after the divine soul is infused in Adam, and as we explained in the Zohar and Kabbalah, and Adam was the mother soul, and from Adam and Eve came all the souls and children underneath it. So thus all human species, unlike the animals and the trees and the grass and the tomatoes and the potatoes, only the human species, the descendants of Adam and Eve, they also have this divine soul. But it's somewhat of a stretch because after time of a few generations, let's say, so this divine soul, we can possibly think, is somewhat disconnected from God. There was God from the beginning of time, 5,782 years ago. And then a few generations later, okay, we can believe in theory. We can agree that Judaism had this theology that there's this divine soul that we call and it's infused in the human species. But how do I say that I thus now have a power to do great things because I have this divine soul in me? Or because I have a divine soul in me, I now can have a relationship with God. And I can pray, and I can study Torah, and I can meditate. Unlike trees, they cannot have a relationship with God. They cannot meditate. They can do other wonderful things like dolphins and so forth. But the human species, because we have this divine soul, so we can truly have this relationship with God. In addition to what I explained before, the power of the divine soul that allows me to control my temptations and my addictions and being angry and everything else that we talked about at the end of chapter 1. This divine soul gives me the power, and it also gives me the ability to have this relationship with God. But it's many years later, and it's many generations later. So I can believe that God created the world, but to say that there's this divine soul in me, I mean, could be a little bit far-fetched. So that's why the Tanya continues and gives you another metaphor that we come from God's brain, which is also, of course, a metaphor because God doesn't have a brain. So what does he mean to say? There is an opinion in science, and the Tanya gives this very graphic example of the semen coming from the father's brain, which is then enclosed into his man has a relationship with a woman. The woman incubates with her egg and the sperm cells over 9 months and produces a child. It's funny that we're having this discussion with all the hoopla on the news now with Roe versus Wade, whatever it is over there. But in any case, this is a very graphic example that the author of the Tanya brings to our attention. And he clearly takes an opinion. I don't have Stephen with me, the scientist, but in Adin Steinsaltz's book, he actually gives you the source of the scientist that the author of the Tanya holds, which is that the semen of the human, of the male, initially is being physically formulated behind a certain part of his brain. Ultimately, the fluids and so forth is properly processed and developed, coming out of the male, and then ultimately going into the woman, and the woman incubating, and then you have a little bit later, 9 months later, a child. Now, how is it that this father only gave 1 drop of semen, and 9 months later, a child is born, possibly with the same color hair as the father? And even if it's not the same color hair, it's possible that he made this son may look like the father, or the daughter may even have features and eyes or nose like the father, such irrelevant, the son or the daughter. Down to the fingers. I remember one time a person saw my fingers and says, Mendel, you have your father's fingers. Down to the toes, even down to the toenails. And all this came, these similarities came just from this 1 drop of semen that went into the woman. You have in this drop of semen from the male, from the father, thousands and thousands of, who knows, certain things in biology, the molecules and the atoms and whatever they call it in this 1 drop, in the what we call the DNA. And in there, even though you don't see it in this drop of semen, at least my naked eye doesn't see it, but in that drop, in that DNA already has and possesses in it, which is properly developed by the mother over 9 months, it's in there, in that 1 drop, you already have the hair that's going to later be on the child, the same matching hair or the curly hair. My hair is curly like my grandfather, not like my father, and so on and so forth. So even though there's a separation between the father and the son physically, because all there was the father giving a drop of semen, but the fact is 9 months later and many years later, I still have a resemblance, or a girl can have a resemblance like the father. Again, we're just giving this to you as an example to show that even though there's this tremendous disconnect, I'm 46 years old, something that happened with my parents 46 years ago, but in that drop, there was something in there which was properly developed by the mother. And here I am today with many of the physical resemblances of my father. Not only physical resemblances, but personalities. I can have a personality like my father. I can have a sense of humor like my father. I can have anxiety like my father, whatever the case is, and you fill it in. So many things besides my physical appearances, but even my characteristic traits were all encompassed in that 1 drop of semen. Just like someone in the world of botany can look at the rings of a tree and can see many things coming, like whether it's apples or oranges, you can see from the rings or from the bark or from the source or the roots of a tree, you can see if it was apples, if it was trees, or what's things like that. So you can see a lot from its source if you have the proper eye for it. Not everyone does, right? Even today, with all the technology we have today, I don't think doctors or scientists can prove from this 1 drop of semen from the DNA there if the child is going to have. Maybe today they can prove if the child is going to have years later or a year later or 9 months later, black hair or brown hair and things like that. But I don't think they can prove what kind of characteristic traits I'm going to have when I'm an adult, sense of humor and all these other things that I take after my father. Some people say, Mendel, you take this after your mother, this after your father, and so on and so forth. So the point why I'm saying all this, why the author is bringing all this, is to tell us that even though we're in 2022. But when we say that God infused in the human species this divine soul, which is carried on to the child, which is carried on to the next child, and carried on to the next child, we are concluding that down to the fingernails of the child, or down to the fingernails when this child is going to be 70 years old, it all stems and roots back and returns and goes back to the father. And where in the father, according to the scientists? From the back of the brain, from the thought. So it's not that it's coming from like the arm of the father, or it's coming from an organ from the father. It's coming from the essence of the father, from his brain. And this again is just another metaphor to show how we, this human, the divine soul, is coming from the essence of godliness, from his thought. And not only that, but even hundreds of years later and generations later, we're still intertwined perfectly to its original source, which is the father and the father's brain. Okay, I know this is a lot of information, and I don't want to overload you too much more before I continue. So if you have any questions, now would be your time before I move on. If you have any questions, I'm open to it.
Rabbi Mendel? Sure.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. What I love the way you've been explaining it. My one question is that there's the DNA from the mother's egg is equally as significant, and children, you can have some characteristics of your mother, some features of your mother. So it's not you the way you're describing it sounds like it's all from the father. And you mentioned the mother incubates for 9 months, and I'm not doing a feminist thing.
No.
But
I'm happy you brought it up.
But
so two reasons why. What you're saying is correct. So you're saying why we focus on the father, not the mother.
Well, and the mother is more than an incubator. She contributes an equal amount of DNA, and also some of who you are is from your nurturing, from your background, the family that you were raised in. So some of your characteristics, being like one parent or the other, is not just something that was innately within you, but we're all the result of not only our parents and all our predecessors, but the environment in which we're raised.
Yeah. So what you're saying is 100%. I remember asking this very question, and I was perhaps more of the progressive in my class when I was learning this back in the yeshiva. And so what my teacher told me is like this: two things. One is to bring the example of from the mother would be a no-brainer, so to speak, because the mother is fully in control of this child. Not only is she giving the egg with the ovaries and everything else, but she's also carrying the child for 9 months. So it's the question of how can the child, which is disconnected from the parent 40, 50, 60 years later, still be connected to the parent? That question is less when we're dealing with the mother, because the mother had control of the child for 9 months. And like you say, gave the DNA. The question is more on the father. How is the child connected to the father? He only gave a drop of semen. He almost did nothing. So that's point one. Why we talked, the mother is not a question. It was more in the father, who only is contributing so little for one split second. And yet we're still saying the child is intertwined and connected with the father from the beginning of time. And we actually see it physically, that even the fingers, like I gave you the example of the way my fingers look, and the personality and the characteristic traits and the fingernails down to the toenails, it still even has a resemblance to the father. This is an incredible thing. This question is greater when we're dealing with the father, who gives so little. Mm-hmm. So that's why we brought the example of the father. And the other reason why we brought the example of the father, the metaphor, and we're bringing a metaphor which is using the father as opposed to the mother, is because in the case of the metaphor bringing the father, according to the scientists, by the way, not all scientists agree with this, but the author of Tanya is taking that scientific opinion, which is that the semen is coming from the brain of the father, which is what we are trying to do in our example, that the child doesn't just come from the parent, but it comes from the essence of the parent. And the essence of the parent is the person's brain, the father's brain. Even the semen, which, as we said, just one split, almost nothing is contributing, but even that, because it came originally and was initially formulated in the back of the father's brain, that's why many years later, the child still possesses many characteristics and personalities and similarities as a father. In the case of the mother, because, like you say, she's giving the eggs and the ovaries, and she's carrying the child for 9 months, it's not, God forbid, I'm saying she's only doing that. It's she's doing all of that. But in that metaphor, that scientific metaphor, because the semen is coming from the father's essence, again, it shows a little bit more of this essential bond that the child is having with the father. Again, there's many children that have red hair like the mother and everything else, but we're just showing how it's only a drop of semen for 1 split second can come in, and the child many years later can still have this relationship and connections because it came from the father's, not just came from the father's semen, but the child came from the father's brain. Even though you would say, what do you mean he came from the father's essence? Came from just a drop of semen? No, he came from the father's essence. So too with us, even though it's many years later, and we have a human species, we have arms and legs, and this has nothing to do with godliness. There's God in the heavens and there's me, but no, because I initially carried this divine soul that God himself infused in me, that relationship carries in a very essential way, hundreds of years later, the same way a child's personality and characteristic traits are carried and remain true many, many years later, because he came from the father's essence. Of course, we have many metaphors to talk about the child coming from the mother's essence and things like that, but that's not the point here. The point we're trying to stress is how seemingly they're so disconnected, and yet with the metaphor, we're bringing them back together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. What's also interesting to note in this point of discussion is the child in this metaphor, even if the child is estranged from the parent, and the child says, I don't want to speak to you, and the child says, I have nothing to do with you, and the child is doing everything that the parent asked the child not to do, too bad, because the child possesses the essence of the parent. And in our metaphor with God and the divine soul, the child, the human species, possesses the divine soul. So even if a Jew says, I don't believe in Judaism, or I believe in Judaism, but I don't believe in the divine soul, but I believe that I have a soul the same way trees and animals have a soul, it's irrelevant to us, because God blew life in the human species. So if you speak to an atheist or an agnostic and so on and so forth, they believe in theory about God, but they don't believe in this discussion. It's irrelevant to me, because God infused the divine soul in the human species. And this is also important to know, because when you see somebody who is a sinner day and night and day and night, when that person would came by the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, what would the Rebbe do? Give that person a dollar bill on Sunday, give him charity, the same way the greatest tzaddik would receive a dollar bill. Because to the Rebbe's eyes, there's no difference with you, the Jew, that is a sinner 50% of the time, or me, the Jew, that's a sinner 70% of the time, or the Jew that never sins. Because a true Kabbalist, all he sees is the divine soul in you, the divine power in you, the divine power and your capabilities and your potential. We, the human species, and me included, we're always quick to judge. You didn't invite me for Thanksgiving, I'm not going to invite you next year. Or I was so nice, I went to the hospital and I gave all these gifts and you did not. There's a million examples can go run through our brain of how we are judgy and judging family members and neighbors and things like that. Okay, listen, that's the way the world works. I mean, again, I'm not a tzaddik, I'm not a Rebbe, so that's me. I judge sometimes, fine. But a true tzaddik, or a person that truly understands this chapter 2 of Tanya, and I would say my father Schwartzy was very good at this. I'm not saying he was a tzaddik in all levels, but when I would ask him, like, why are you giving so much time to this Meshuggah on Venice Beach? He saw in that person this divine soul that, I mean, I believed it because I read chapter 2, but he really, really, really connected with this idea that every human being has this divine soul. So from the divine soul perspective, there's no difference with you and me. The divine soul, this human being, is actually greater than even the greatest of angels, because the greatest of angels don't even have this divine soul. They are a creature, whereas the human species is carrying the divine. So there's a lot of things that, practically speaking, are actually implemented in our life when we truly can appreciate this idea of the divine soul. That the human being now can have a relationship with God, unlike a lot of other creatures. 2, I have the power to suppress a lot of evil traits that I have in me, or temptations that I want to do, or sleep in late, or not get a job, or be mean to other people, and so on and so forth, because I have the divine soul in me, which that recognition alone should help me get control of myself and get control over my life. 3, the divine soul allows me not to be judging on other people, to be kind to other people, because we have this, the divine soul. So really, when I'm respecting you, even if I don't like your characteristic trait so much, because you're not a nice person, and maybe that's true, but your essence is not even some of the things you did today. The same way when my child comes home from school and he misbehaved and he even got punished, why do I still love him? He misbehaved today, and he really misbehaved, and he deserved to get punished, and he deserved to get hit and everything else. Because there's a certain appreciation, or rather there's a certain love that I have to my child, which is unconditional, because he's my child, she's my child. So I don't really care that she misbehaved. I'm going to try to educate my child to behave like a mensch, but this is my child. That is the draw. That is the what's the word I'm looking for? What gravitates. That's the draw that gravitated a Rebbe, a spiritual master, to every single human species. Because you are a walking, carrying God. And this is a major, major point in our Jewish literature. And you should know this idea when we have in the Talmud of the case of the convert that came to Beis Shammai, to the house of Shammai, to tell me the whole Torah on 1 foot. And the guy said, lose my number. And when the convert came to the house of Hillel, what did Rabbi Hillel say? What's the whole Torah on 1 foot? Love thy fellow as yourself. And you can think for a second, hold on a minute, there really are 613 commandments. Why did he choose this one? Again, it's not because he was a California guy, a California liberal, whatever, a progressive rabbi that's all about love, 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 and everything else is a waste. No, this is Hillel from the times of the Talmud. And yet he said, love thy fellow as thyself. Why? Because loving thy fellow means loving God. If you're not going to love thy fellow, how can you say you love God? Because God is in that fellow that you are disliking. That's almost a form of idol worship. So Hillel said, you want to know the whole Torah on 1 foot? You want to know Judaism on 1 foot? You love everything. Love thy fellow as thyself. So that is pretty much it. And we'll stop the class with that.